quick little add-on about imaginary numbers. We all know that I equals the square root of -1, and then I squared must be I times I to get I squared, and then I is the square root of -1 times another I, which is the square root of -1, making that all equal the square root of -1 squared. But what do you think that square and the square root do to each other? Well, they cancel each other out, leaving just -1. So I squared must be -1. Here we have I to the third, or I cubed. Well, I cubed is made up of an I squared times a I. Well, I squared turns into be a -1 from right here, and then we have I, which stays I, so I to the third then turns into a negative I, and then finally I to the fourth. Well, we know that I to the fourth is made up of I squared times I squared. I squared, what's it turn into? Oh, well, that's a -1 times another -1, and we know that -1 times -1 is 1. So I to the fourth is just a 1. So how does this relate to us? How does this help us out? Well, I to the 13th. I to the 13th, we can figure that out by taking I to the fourth times I to the fourth times I to the fourth. Well, that's 12. We need one more, so it has to be times I. Well, I to the fourth is just 1 times 1 times 1 times I. So I to the 13th is just I, because 1 times 1 times 1 times I is I. How about I to the 23rd? Well, I don't want to do it the same way as this, because that would be a lot of I to the fourth, right? It would be I to the fourth times I to the fourth times I to the fourth. I'm already getting tired of writing I to the fourth, but there are 5 I to the fourth times I to the third. All of these guys turn into 1, and then I to the third turns into a negative I, so our answer would be -I. Well, there has to be a better way of doing this, right? Sure there is. Take 23, divide it by 4, right? So I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way. I'm going to go 4 outside, and I'm going to put 23 inside. 4 goes into 23 how many times? 5. 4 times 5 is 20. I subtract to get 3, so I have a remainder of 3, right? That would be your I to the third. Again, I to the third equals a negative I. How about I to the 24th? Again, that would be writing a lot of I to the fourth, so let's just take our power of 4 and divide it into 24. 24 divided by 4 is 6. Oh, that's an even number. What does that tell us? Well, that tells us that there is no remainder, so I to the fourth goes into I to the 24th 6 times with no remainder, so that has to equal just a 1. That means that there's I to the fourth in here 6 times. It would just be 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1, and it all equals 1. And finally, I know this isn't an imaginary number, but it's the square root of x to the fifth. Let's pretend that there is a 2 right above this square root. Well, this 2 goes into that 5 2 times, so I'm going to pull that out, but remember it's an exponent, so it's going to be x squared. Now what does this mean? Well, this means that I have this square root with that little 2 right there of x squared times x squared times x. I just took out one of these and one of these, right, to get x squared. What's the remainder? What's still inside the square root? That is going to be the square root of x. So this bad boy right here simplifies into this nice x squared times the square root of x.